Hi everyone, my name's Uma, and this is lecture 10, your lecture on data storytelling. I'll later be joined by a lot of other people, and this is your final lecture of the semester. On behalf of everyone on the course staff, we want to thank you for being a part of this course. We hope you had a great experience and picked up some new skills along the way. Some logistics: you do not have a lab due this week. Second, the final module of the project will be due May 10th. And third, keep your eye out on Piazza for a course feedback form that'll be released sometime this week. The agenda for today's lecture is, first, I'll talk about the data science lifecycle to recap everything we've sort of done this semester. Second, we'll have an in-depth case study that's related to COVID-19, followed by 3 more case studies related to music, sports, and politics. Data science lifecycle. So the data science lifecycle was introduced to you in the Pandas Part 1 lecture and is really the motivation for this course. This lecture will serve as an in-depth recap of that, but with stronger emphasis on number 6, data visualization. So first we start here at intuition and understanding. Before you even begin a project, you should know the subject you're working with and understand the type of data you'll be dealing with. It's important before you even decide to touch your computer to understand the motivation behind the project that you're trying to do or whatever you're trying to convince an audience of. Second, we delve into data mining. You learned that you saw a little bit of this when you learned Excel and SQL. Being able to mine for data that you need for a project is really important. Third, data cleaning. This was a large focus of the course, and it's because its applications are so important. For example, removing NaN values or irrelevant or corrupted parts of your data to make it useful for your project. Now, fourth, data exploration, which is tied a little bit to cleaning. But in a sense, you're understanding the various nuances and the values your data has presented you. So summarizing characteristics of your data like means, modes, etc. We didn't do too much of number 5, modeling, in this course, but it's also really important, so I'll move on. Lastly, data visualization. So all the cleaning, the exploration has led you to this point, to be able to tell insightful and compelling stories through visuals and communicate findings to audiences that may not have a technical background. Now, what's the motivation for all of this? Your skills as a data scientist are really only as good as your abilities to communicate a finding to larger audiences. I said this before in the data visualization lecture, but it still holds. Data storytelling can help explain the world around us. And that's largely due to the fact that stories are effective. They're very effective tools in communicating human experience, whether it be tracking profits over time or monitoring technological advances or something else that directly impacts us all, like COVID-19. Gathering and proving an insight you've uncovered through your data analysis is far more effective than simply explaining it in a verbal presentation. Data is really convincing. Trying to verbally persuade someone that company profits are skyrocketing is really difficult and almost useless if you don't have the proper data to substantiate whatever you're saying. And the visualization and storytelling aspect of it is very convincing to audiences, regardless of technical background. And now we're going to go into our in-depth case study of COVID-19. The goal of this case study is to determine the impact of lockdown measures on the spread of COVID-19 cases. And we're not limiting this to just America, this is worldwide, and we'll take it country by country. But just to recap, lockdown measures are restrictions on social contact, and it's often what we refer to when we think of this whole quarantine situation. Some countries have military lockdown measures, whereas others have imposed less harsh shelter-in-place policies or other partial lockdown measures. Now, the way we're going to go about this case study is, first I'll introduce our data, introduce the types of data we're working with. Then Luke will talk about how he's going to go about cleaning the data and analyzing it. Nikhil will put these into visualizations, and then Avik will perform a hypothesis test. Now we're going to move on to talking about the data sets we're going to be working with for this case study. We're doing so because understanding the type of data you're working with as well as where your data is coming from, is very critical to being able to explain your findings to other people. So we'll talk about our first data set, government measures by date. I recommend full screening this presentation, at least for this portion, because I know some of the entries are kind of tiny, and hopefully it will help visualizing it better. So government lockdown measures are an essential component to our study because we are discussing the impact of specific lockdown measures on the spread of COVID-19 cases. Now, the data set that we got from ACAPS contains various government measures implemented to tackle coronavirus, like limiting public gatherings, lockdown measures, of course, awareness campaigns, and health screenings in airports. But we really only care about the lockdown measures. As you can also see, they have the date of implementation of all these measures, as well as a bit of a description to the side right here. And I just took a snapshot of South Korea just for explanation's sake, but they do have many other countries like America, Tanzania, etc. And the type of data we're working with here is categorical. And there are different categories for different lockdown measures. For example, as I said before, different countries have implemented stricter measures, like military enforced lockdown versus the shelter in place that we currently have in the Bay Area. Here we see that here in South Korea, we just have a partial lockdown measure, and that's important to note because this is a separate category of lockdown. Moving on to data set 2, these are confirmed COVID-19 cases over time. And actually the dates span a lot further in the past than just this. Again, this is just a snapshot, and as you can see, there are many countries here on the left. And I'm using this to compare how many cases there were before and after a lockdown measure was implemented. So this will be very critical in determining the lockdown's effect on the actual number of confirmed cases. Also, just to reiterate, these are confirmed cases. This is from Johns Hopkins University, and they have a whole repository of COVID-19 data that I recommend checking out if you're interested. The type of data we're working with here is quantitative. This is quantitative data, and these are very discrete measurements because either someone has COVID-19 or someone doesn't. There's really no in-between continuous realm that this data could occupy. Now, moving on to our third data set. So we're separating our study into 2 prongs, developed countries and developing countries. How did we determine this classification? Well, we took this data set from the United Nations and we're separating it into 2 prongs to account for the structural differences that occur between these types of countries. There are actually really 3. Just a disclaimer, transition economies are the last one, but there are so few of them, so we're not going to include them in our study. This is categorical data, but it's important to understand why the UN chose these categories and assigned them to specific countries, as these classifications with these types of data sets are really important as they influence our findings. So the UN classified countries based on the Human Development Index, which is an index that contains various indicators, various economic indicators and social indicators to determine how developed a country is. I won't go too much into detail with that, but I recommend checking it out because it's very essential to how the UN determined this, or to the UN guide this data set. They also used oil exports and gross national income, that's GNI. GNI per capita and GNI overall in the country. Now, moving on to data set 4. So now we have data on the populations themselves. And we have data on the population over time. We're really not going to take the entire population over time. But as you can see, we have it by country once again. And we're doing this because we need to normalize the amount of COVID-19 cases relative to the population of that country itself. Like, for example, comparing COVID-19 cases in Botswana to the number of cases in Spain won't exactly tell us a lot since they have drastically different population sizes. So to have a more meaningful gauge of COVID-19's impact on a country, we must compare the confirmed cases to the total population. Now, these are some things to think about when you're going about starting a project of your own, and it's also some stuff we're thinking about as we do this case study. So where am I getting my data from? Are there any potential biases in this data? Is the organization I'm getting data from skewed towards proving a certain point? Is the data I'm working with accurate? Or how will the type of data I'm working with influence my findings? I mentioned categorical data in the context of economic development and classification, because classifying countries as developing versus developed is very critical in determining their structures. Let's go back. Now I'll briefly talk about the sources where we got our data. Understanding where our data comes from is just as important as understanding the data itself. So where we got data set one was ACAPS, ACAPS, which is a nonprofit, non-governmental organization that provides a lot of humanitarian data and analysis. They pride themselves on being independent of any government organization like the United Nations or the World Bank. Second, we got our COVID-19 confirmed case data from Johns Hopkins University, which is a university right here in America in Baltimore, Maryland. Then we got our other data from the United Nations, which is an intergovernmental organization that aims to promote peace and diplomatic relations amongst countries around the world. And then lastly, we got data from the World Bank, which is a financial institution that gives loans to poor and developing countries to promote growth.